She made me beg for money at her family dinner. My best friend paid my way. She's been in love with me for over a decade. She's never said a word. Now, sitting on a porch in Vermont as the sun sets over the mountains, she's finally telling me the truth. Her voice is steady, her hand finding mine in the darkness. "I have been waiting for a very long time," she says. "But something is different now." Something broke open when she showed up at that restaurant with her credit card. She saw what was happening to me. She saw me disappearing into someone else's life, and she made a choice. She walked into that moment and claimed me as someone worth saving. Now she's asking if I'm ready to choose her instead. This is the night everything changes. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The thing about the degradation of self is that it never announces itself. It does not arrive as a moment where you are suddenly struck by the understanding that you are disappearing. Instead, it accumulates in small fractions that feel like nothing individually, but which, when you finally add them together, reveal that you have been slowly erased and replaced with someone else's idea of who you should be. That is what had happened to me over 8 months with Cassidy Webb. She had not pushed me into a hole. She had simply narrowed the doorway so incrementally, with such precision and grace, that I had walked through it myself and only later discovered that the doorway had been designed to trap me. I had met Cassidy at a gallery opening in Manhattan on a Tuesday night in July, which is one of those details that seems insignificant until you realize that your entire life has pivoted on the axis of that evening. I was there because my best friend Jules had spent weeks manipulating me into the event through a combination of guilt and genuine concern for my existence. Jules had a particular talent for cutting through the lies people tell themselves. She knew that I had spent 37 consecutive nights working on a litigation case for a firm that barely knew my name. She knew that I had stopped returning her calls. She knew that I was using work as an excuse to avoid the fact that my life had contracted into nothing but billable hours and the specific anxiety that comes from realizing you are exchanging your youth for a retirement you would never enjoy. So, on a Tuesday in July, Jules had called me at the office and told me that I had 2 hours to go home, change, and meet her at a gallery opening in Tribeca. She had not framed it as an option. She had framed it as an intervention. I protested, but Jules was insistent. I changed into a black dress and met her at the gallery at 8 o'clock. Jules introduced me, then left me alone. That is where I found Cassidy, standing alone in front of a painting. Her eyes were gray, and they had the particular quality of someone who was used to finding what they wanted because they were willing to look longer than most people would. She looked at me for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to the painting. But something had registered. Something had landed between us in the space of those 3 seconds, and I had understood, with absolute certainty, that she had just decided something about me, that I had been assessed and found worth deciding about. Jules found me and said, "You are making the puzzle face. That never leads anywhere good." By the end of the evening, Cassidy had maneuvered me into a corner of the gallery, and she was telling me about the art world in a way that made it clear she understood it was mostly a scheme to move money around. She was explaining the mechanisms of auction houses and art investment and the way that taste was manufactured through scarcity, and I was listening like she was explaining the meaning of life. And she was watching me listen with an expression that suggested she was pleased with what I was understanding. She took my phone, entered her number, and handed it back. She had said, "I would like to take you to dinner. Somewhere that is not full of people pretending to understand things they do not." I had said yes, because I was 29 years old, and I had been alone for long enough that I had stopped noticing I was lonely. Because Cassidy Webb had looked at me like choosing me was a decision she had already made and was simply waiting for me to accept. When I got home that evening, I had texted Jules and told her that I had met someone. Jules had called me immediately and asked every version of the question that meant, "What is wrong with this person, that you are already attached to them?" I had told her that nothing was wrong. She was beautiful and intelligent and interested in me. I was not explaining that last part very well, but it was the most important part. Jules had said, "Be careful, okay? People who seem like they have everything figured out are sometimes exactly what they appear to be. But they are also sometimes people who are very good at making other people small. I had told her that I appreciated her concern but that she was being paranoid and that not every person I met was going to be someone who wanted to control me. I had promised myself that I would stay aware. I had promised myself that I would not repeat the patterns of my previous relationships. I had broken both promises within 2 months. Cassidy took me to dinner the following Friday. She chose a restaurant that had a 3-month waiting list. She had a reservation for 8:30 because she was the kind of person who could get reservations at restaurants with 3-month waiting lists. The restaurant was in the West Village, and it was beautiful in that oppressive way that restaurants with serious money tend to be. Everything was expensive and quiet and arranged to make you feel like you were not worth the space you were taking up. She ordered wine without consulting the menu. She told the sommelier exactly what she wanted and explained, very briefly, why. She was knowledgeable in a way that suggested this was not the first time she had ordered wine at this restaurant or any restaurant. She asked me questions. She asked me about my family. She asked me about my work. She asked me what I wanted. Not in the surface way that most people ask questions at first dates, but in the way that suggested she actually wanted to know the answers. She paid attention to my responses. She asked follow-up questions. She made me feel like my thoughts mattered. I had found out later that she was 42 years old. She had inherited money from her family, which was old money in the way that means it had been accumulating for generations. She had gone to Yale. She had gotten an MBA. She had become a private equity investor and had become very good at identifying opportunities and capitalizing on them. She was also, I would find out much later, very good at identifying people and understanding how to shape them into versions that were more useful to her purposes. That night she had simply been charming. She had simply been interested. She had simply been the most compelling person I had ever met. And I had been too tired and too lonely to notice the difference between being charmed and being hunted. By the end of the dinner, she had asked me to accompany her on a weekend trip to the Hamptons. I had said yes. I was already falling, and falling people do not tend to make careful decisions. The first 2 months were extraordinary in a way that made everything before them seem like it had not been real. Cassidy took me to restaurants where the chef knew her name and had prepared special things for her. She took me to galleries opening before the public. She introduced me to wine and to the world of people who had sufficient wealth to move through it without paying much attention to the cost of things. She also started making observations about my life that were framed as care, but that had a particular cutting edge underneath them. She suggested that my apartment was in a terrible neighborhood. She said that my job was beneath my capabilities and that I should aspire to better things. She mentioned that my wardrobe reflected the limited budget of my previous life and that she would like to help me move beyond it. When I pushed back on any of it, she had a particular way of making me feel like the pushing back was rejection, like I was choosing poverty over her protection, like I was choosing danger over her care. Like I did not understand that love required letting someone help you become a better version of yourself. She said to me one evening in September, "I think you could be extraordinary, but you are holding yourself back. You are afraid. Fear is what keeps people small." I had believed her. I had believed that she was trying to help me. I had believed that accepting her help meant accepting her vision of who I could become. In September, Jules had called me and asked if I wanted to get dinner. I had said that I was busy. I was busy in the particular way that people who are falling in love are busy, which is to say, I had made a decision to prioritize one person and had decided that everyone else was secondary. Jules had said, "I miss you." I had said, "I know. I am sorry. I will do better." But I had not done better. I had continued to be less and less available until Jules had stopped calling because the pattern had become clear. I was choosing Cassidy. I was choosing to pull away from the people who had known me before Cassidy arrived. Cassidy had suggested, very gently, that this was probably for the best. She had said that best friends from college were often people who kept you tethered to your previous self, and that my previous self was someone I needed to leave behind. I had believed her. I had been too in love to notice that I was being asked to make choices that had less to do with love and more to do with isolation. By October, Cassidy had suggested that I move in with her. The Chelsea apartment was beautiful. It had floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick, and the kind of appliances that real money produces. It had been designed with an eye toward minimalism and perfection. Everything was in its place. Everything was exactly as Cassidy wanted it. And that was the problem. Not the apartment itself, but the fact that every inch of it was an extension of Cassidy's taste, and Cassidy's vision, and Cassidy's desire for how a space should look and feel. I had called Jules and told her that I was moving. Jules had come over that night and had helped me pack the things that mattered. We had sat on the floor of my apartment on the last night I lived there, and Jules had asked me very carefully if I was sure about this. If I was sure about Cassidy. I had said yes to all of it. I had believed yes in the way that people believe things when they are in the middle of falling. Jules had helped me pack instead of arguing, because she was the kind of friend who understands that some people have to learn lessons the hard way. The transition to Cassidy's apartment had been seamless. One day I was unpacking boxes, and the next day I was living a life where everything had been arranged according to someone else's specifications. The art on the walls was not art I had chosen. The books on the shelves were ones that Cassidy deemed worthy. The kitchen had a system for organization that Cassidy had developed, and that required me to learn where everything belonged. This might have been fine if Cassidy had simply had strong preferences about how space was organized, but Cassidy's preferences extended to every visible surface and also to the invisible ones. She had opinions about the way I ate breakfast. She had observations about the way I made coffee. She suggested that the scent of my particular brand was too strong and lingered inappropriately, and that I should consider switching to something that was less aromatic. These were small things, tiny corrections, the kind that sound like nothing when you are reading about them but which accumulate like water against stone. Eventually the stone wears away. Eventually, you are standing in a different landscape than the one you started in. By November, Cassidy had taken control. She selected my outfits, chose my restaurants, decided when I saw friends. She suggested my friends weren't sophisticated, and that I was limiting myself. That is when the financial control began in earnest. She had suggested it as practical. We were living together, she had said. It made sense to consolidate our finances. I had a decent salary as a paralegal, but it was nothing compared to what she made. She had suggested that I put my paycheck into a joint account that she would manage. She would give me an allowance, she had explained, to handle my personal expenses. This way, she could protect me from myself, and we could build our financial life together. I had said yes because I was in love. Because nobody had ever offered to take care of me before. Because Cassidy had a way of making me feel like refusing her care was a rejection of her love itself. The allowance started at $3,000 per month. By the standards of normal life, it was generous. But I had previously earned that amount bi-weekly, and the shift to monthly meant that I had to think about spending in a way I had never had to before. Every coffee was a choice. Every book required negotiation. Every small indulgence meant reduction in funds for the rest of the month. The allowance started to decrease in January. Cassidy had explained that she was noticing patterns of frivolous spending. I was buying too many clothes. I was eating lunch out too often. I was spending on things that did not matter. So she was adjusting the allowance to $2,500 to encourage more mindful spending. I had accepted this. I had been grateful, even. Cassidy was trying to help me become a better version of myself. That had become the refrain that explained everything. Cassidy was helping me. Cassidy was correcting me. Cassidy was shaping me into someone worth being. By February, the allowance was $2,200. By March, it was down to $1,800. By April, it was $1,500. By May, it was $1,100. And by the time we reached June, I was living on $1,000 per month for all personal expenses, which meant that I could not buy lunch. I could not buy coffee. I could not buy the luxury of existing outside of the home without asking Cassidy's permission and justifying the expense. By then I had stopped calling Jules. She said she was worried. I pulled away. I had responded less frequently to her messages. I had stopped calling her. I had let the friendship fray at the edges because Cassidy had suggested that this was probably for the best. And Jules, who loved me and understood that people in situations like mine rarely respond to dramatic interventions, had let me pull away while staying available in case I needed to pull back. The family dinner was scheduled for June. Cassidy spent weeks preparing me. She selected my navy dress and did my hair her way. That her family was very particular. That they would be assessing whether I was suitable. I had asked if I was nervous. She had said, "You should be. My family is very important to me. This needs to go well." I had felt the specific weight of that. The understanding that my performance was not about me. It was about whether I was worthy of her. Whether I had learned well enough to pass the test she was administering. We had arrived at the restaurant at 7 o'clock. The restaurant was beautiful in that oppressive way. Everything was low-key and elegant, and arranged to make you feel like you were being assessed. I had understood immediately that I was. Cassidy had guided me to the table with her hand on the small of my back. A small gesture. A gesture that looked like affection. A gesture that was actually territory marking. Cassidy's mother was exactly what I had expected. Cold. Composed. The kind of woman who had raised a daughter like Cassidy and who had taught her how to use silence as a weapon. Cassidy's father was a gentleman in the way that old money sometimes produces gentlemen, distant, kind in a surface way that meant nothing. There were siblings and cousins and uncles and aunts. All of them looked at me with assessment. All of them were calibrating whether I was suitable. I had answered their questions carefully. I had been attentive to Cassidy. I had deferred to her. I had tried to make myself smaller so that she would appear larger. And it had been working. I could feel it. The family was warming to me. I was passing the test. The evening was proceeding exactly as Cassidy had choreographed. We had dinner with her family, 30 people in a private room. I answered their questions carefully. I had been attentive to Cassidy, deferring to her in everything, trying to make myself smaller so that she would appear larger. And it had been working. The family was warming to me, calibrating whether I was suitable. Then we had ordered dessert. And Cassidy had ordered wine. She had looked at the wine list and turned to me and said, "Order something. Something you like." I had looked at the wine list. The Sancerre was $98. That was almost 2 months of my allowance. But Cassidy had told me to order what I liked, and something in her expression told me that this was a test of a different kind. I had said, "The Sancerre." Cassidy had smiled. It was a smile I had learned to recognize. It was the smile of someone who had just set a trap and was waiting to see if I would step in it. And then when the server had come with the bill, she had turned to me and said, very quietly, "I forgot my wallet. It is in the car." I had felt the world shift. I had understood, in the way you understand things when you are in a relationship with someone who is clever about cruelty, that this had been planned. That the forgetting had not been accidental. That this was a setup designed to humiliate me in front of the people Cassidy cared about most. I had said, "I can get it." Quote. She had looked at me with an expression that combined disappointment and affection in equal measure. She had said, "It is your wine. You ordered it. You should handle it." The server was waiting. 30 of Cassidy's family members were watching. I had understood, in that moment, exactly what was happening. This was not a test of my financial responsibility. This was a test of my willingness to be humiliated. A test of whether I had been trained well enough to accept degradation without resistance. I had reached for my purse. I had pulled out the debit card Cassidy had given me. The card to access the allowance that had been reduced to $1,000 per month. The card that controlled whether I could exist outside of her authority. The card had been declined. There had been an absolute silence, the kind of silence that only happens when something has gone publicly wrong. Then Cassidy's mother had laughed. A small, sharp sound, like breaking glass. Cassidy had looked at me and said, "It seems your card is not working. How unfortunate." I had felt my face go hot. I had looked around the table, 30 pairs of eyes watching to see what I would do, whether I would refuse, whether I would push back, whether I had been trained well enough. The server had looked uncomfortable. He had said, "Perhaps I could run it again." And Cassidy had said, "No, let her handle it. She made the choice to order the wine. She should handle the consequences." I had sat there in the silence, and I had understood that I had been deliberately set up to fail. That Cassidy had reduced my allowance, knowing that the wine would be too expensive. That she had encouraged me to order something I could not afford, so that I would humiliate myself in front of her family. That this was not about wine or financial responsibility. This was about power, about making me small in front of the people who mattered to her. I had looked at the server and I had said, very quietly, "Could you give me a moment?" And I had looked at Cassidy and I had said, "Could you lend me the money?" And Cassidy had done something absolutely horrible. She had reached into her purse slowly, deliberately, while making eye contact with me. She had pulled out a credit card, and she had slid it across the table like I was someone she was firing. The entire table had watched me use my fiancé's card to pay for wine I had been instructed to order. The entire table had witnessed my humiliation, and Cassidy had turned to her mother and made a comment about the chef's recent award like nothing had happened. That is when Jules appeared in the doorway. She stood there with the particular intensity of someone who had been watching from the entrance, who understood exactly what had just happened, who saw me sitting there in my humiliation. She did not look at Cassidy or her family. She looked directly at me. She looked at me like seeing me being destroyed was intolerable to her. She walked to the table with absolute certainty. She did not hesitate. She did not apologize for interrupting. She walked to where Cassidy sat, and she set her credit card down directly on top of Cassidy's card. She said, "Your card is declined. I am paying. You are coming with me." She said it like it was a fact being stated, not a request being made. I had felt something break open inside me, not gently, not gradually, but with the particular violence of someone who has finally run out of room to negotiate with reality. I had stood up. I had gathered my bag. I had walked out of that restaurant without looking back at anyone, without apologizing, without waiting for Cassidy to explain or defend or reframe what had just happened. I had walked into the June evening with Jules, and I had understood, for the first time in 8 months, that I had been living inside a lie that someone else had constructed around me. Jules's car was parked on the street 3 blocks away. She drove me to Astoria without speaking. The silence was not empty. It was full of the things she wanted to say, and the things she understood I needed to not hear yet. She had made tea when we arrived at her apartment. She had given me a sweater that was too big and soft. She had sat on the couch and waited. I had talked for 3 hours straight. I had explained how Cassidy had taken my money and controlled my choices. I had described the allowance and the way it had decreased. I had told her about the clothes and the comments about my body. I had explained how Cassidy had isolated me from the people who loved me and told me it was because they were holding me back. Jules had listened with her face getting progressively harder. She had asked clarifying questions. What exactly had Cassidy said about her? When had the allowance started? What was the lowest it had gone? Jules had pulled out a laptop and had written down everything I told her. She had created a document. She had understood, in a way that I had not yet understood, that what had happened to me required evidence. When I finished, she had said, "You are staying here, for as long as you need. And tomorrow, we are calling a lawyer." That night I had slept on Jules's couch in her apartment. The apartment was small and warm, and filled with things that meant something to her. Not because they were expensive or because they matched some aesthetic, but because she had chosen them with intention. A print from an artist she admired, books that she had actually read, photographs of people she loved arranged on shelves without any particular organization except that they made her smile. It was a space that felt like home, in a way that Cassidy's apartment had never felt like home. Cassidy's apartment had felt like living inside someone else's expectations. I had woken up in the morning, and for the first time in 8 months, I had not immediately called Cassidy. I had not immediately begun apologizing. I had instead sat with the specific understanding that I had been deliberately humiliated in front of 30 people by someone who was supposed to love me. Jules had made coffee. She had given me a clean shirt and had let me use the shower. She had made calls while I cleaned myself up. By the time I emerged, she had the contact information for a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Margot. She specialized in financial abuse cases and domestic situations. She had an opening at 10 in the morning. We had taken a car to her office in Midtown. The office was clean and professional, and arranged in a way that suggested Margot was used to people coming to her in crisis. She had the particular intensity of someone who had seen situations like mine before, and who did not have patience for the version where the person being harmed talked themselves back into the situation. She had asked me very specific questions. When had the financial control started? What did the paper trail look like? Were there emails showing the allowance decreasing? Text messages? Bank statements? Screenshots of conversations? I had shown her everything, the bank records going back months showing the allowance being reduced incrementally, the text messages where Cassidy had outlined the weekly spending budget, the email from Cassidy's company HR, confirming her annual income, which was in the 7-figure range, while she was restricting my access to money like it was a scarce resource. Margot had looked at all of it and had said, very simply, "This is documentation of financial abuse. You can leave whenever you want, you are an adult, but we need to make sure you are protected legally when you do." I had asked her what that meant. She had said, "It means understanding your legal rights. It means gathering evidence. It means having a plan for when she tries to convince you to come back, because she will try. They always try." The appointment had lasted 2 hours. Margot had outlined my options. We could file a report with the police. We could seek a protective order. We could document everything and use it in civil court if there were assets to fight over. Cassidy had money. Cassidy had property. Cassidy had the apartment building in Chelsea that she owned outright. These were things that could become complicated depending on what our legal status was. The key word was our. She and I. We were engaged. We were living together. We had combined finances. If I left, there could be financial claims against me. There could be disputes over shared resources. There could be custody implications if there were assets to fight over. I had sat there and understood that leaving was not going to be simple. That Cassidy had arranged my life in a way that made leaving complicated. That I would need help to untangle myself from her. I had spent that first night in Jules's apartment. I had spent the second night there too. I had not answered Cassidy's calls. She had called 7 times on the first evening. By the second evening she had stopped calling and had started texting. The first text had said, "I understand you are upset. This is temporary. Come home and we can discuss what happened like adults. I am willing to move past this if you are willing to accept responsibility for your own instability." The second text had said, "Your card was declined because the account was overdrawn. You spent too much on unnecessary things. I was trying to teach you discipline." The third text had said, "Jules has always been jealous of what we have. Do not let her poison this. Come home." The fourth text had said, "I made you. I gave you a life. I gave you access to the world you wanted to be in. And this is how you repay me. By running to someone pathetic and desperate who has wanted you for years but never had the spine to say it." I had shown each text to Jules as it came in. Jules had gotten progressively quieter and more focused. Jules had sat at her kitchen table and had eaten almost nothing and had looked at her phone like she was trying to burn holes in it. By the time the fifth text arrived, Jules's face had changed into something harder and more determined than I had seen it be before. The fifth text said, "I suppose Jules told you she loves you. How convenient that she said it exactly when you needed to hear it. I wonder if she has been playing the long game. I wonder if she has been waiting for me to do the work of softening you up. Either way, you are welcome." Jules had read the text. She had set down her phone. She had looked at me with an expression that combined fury and heartbreak in equal measure. She had said, "She just tried to make me the villain in her narrative. She just tried to rewrite the story so that I am the problem, instead of her own cruelty being the problem." I had said, "She is scared." Jules had said, "She is manipulative. There is a difference. A scared person admits what they did. A manipulative person rewrites it so that nothing is their fault." Jules had taken the phone from my hands. She had changed the password. She had taken a screenshot of the text messages. She had forwarded them to Margot. She had said, "We are going to the lawyer tomorrow. We are giving her everything Cassidy has done. And we are going to make sure that when this ends, it ends in a way that protects you." I had asked her how that was possible. Cassidy was smart. Cassidy had money. Cassidy had resources that I did not have. Jules had said, "Cassidy has money, but she also has documentation of her abuse. That money might protect her from some things, but it will not protect her from herself. And right now, she is documenting her own guilt by sending you text messages." The following morning, I had gone with Jules to meet with Margot again. We had brought the phone, we had brought the text messages, we had brought the documentation of every time Cassidy had reduced my allowance, and every time she had made a comment about my body or my choices. Margot had reviewed everything and had said, "I want you to save every single text message. I want you to document every contact she tries to make. I want you to reply to nothing. I want you to give her no ammunition. Do you understand?" I had said yes. I had understood. I was terrified, but I understood. And then, Cassidy had escalated. She had started calling my workplace. She had called the firm and told them that I was having a mental health crisis and that I was not to be trusted with confidential information. She had called my mother. She had called my colleagues. She had started a campaign to suggest that I was unstable and confused and that Jules had taken advantage of my instability to pull me away from the person who loved me. It had almost worked. On the third day away from Cassidy, I had almost called her back and told her that I was sorry for being dramatic. I had almost undone everything Jules had risked by choosing to help me. Then I had gone to Cassidy's apartment to get my things. Margot had insisted on accompanying me. She had explained that I should not go alone and that having a witness was important. We had taken a car to Chelsea on a Tuesday afternoon. Cassidy would be at work. The apartment would be empty. "In and out," Margot had said. "Gather what belongs to you. Do not engage if she comes home." The apartment had felt foreign when I walked through the door. It had felt like stepping into someone else's life. Every object in the space was exactly where it had always been, because Cassidy had a system for everything, and that system was not negotiable. The art on the walls. The books on the shelves arranged by size. The kitchen organized in a way that made sense only to Cassidy. I had gone to the bedroom and had opened the closet. The closet was a study in control. Cassidy's clothes on one side, my clothes on the other side. But the clothes on my side were not clothes I had owned before moving in. They were clothes that Cassidy had selected for me. Clothes that fit her aesthetic. Clothes that looked right to her. I had taken the clothes that were actually mine. The things I had brought with me before Cassidy had decided what I should wear. There were not many. Cassidy had convinced me to discard most of my previous wardrobe. She had suggested that the things I had owned before reflected the limited taste of my previous life. I had filled boxes, 4 boxes of my belongings from an apartment where I had lived for 8 months. That was all that was actually mine. Everything else belonged to Cassidy. Everything else was part of the life she had constructed around me. Margot had stood in the doorway and had watched me pack. She had not said anything. She had simply been present as a witness to the process of reclaiming my life in 4 boxes. When I was done, I had looked around the apartment. I had tried to remember if there was anything else, but there was nothing. There were no photographs of me. There were no personal items that suggested I had ever lived here. There was only Cassidy's taste and Cassidy's vision applied to every visible surface. We had carried the boxes to Margot's car. We had driven back to Jules's apartment in Astoria. And I had understood, in the particular clarity that comes from seeing your life reduced to 4 boxes, exactly how small Cassidy had made me. Exactly how much of myself I had erased to fit into the space she had designed for me. The boxes sat in Jules's living room for 3 days before I could open them. I could not look at them without remembering that these 4 containers represented everything I had brought into Cassidy's life. Everything that was actually mine. Everything else had been gradually replaced with versions that suited Cassidy's aesthetic, and Cassidy's needs, and Cassidy's vision of who I should be. The apartment in Astoria was small and warm, and filled with things that meant something to Jules because she had chosen them with intention. It was nothing like Cassidy's Chelsea apartment, which had been designed to be admired rather than lived in. Jules's space was lived in. It was textured. It was real. On the 4th day, Jules found me staring at the boxes and sitting on her couch in the clothes she had lent me because I had not yet opened my own belongings. She said, "Do you want to open them or do you want to sit with them for a while longer?" I said, "I do not know how to be a person outside of Cassidy's apartment." She said, "Then we will figure it out together. But you are going to need your own clothes to do it." We opened the boxes together on a Saturday afternoon. Jules had made coffee. She had created a specific kind of space where it felt like we were doing something important but not catastrophic. I pulled out the things I had owned before Cassidy. A sweater from college that still smelled like the life I had before her. Books I had loved. A necklace my grandmother had given me that Cassidy had suggested did not work with her aesthetic, and that I had therefore locked away in a drawer for 8 months. Each item was like recovering something I thought I had lost. Each thing was proof that I had existed before Cassidy, and would exist after. Each object was a piece of the version of myself that she had convinced me to erase. Jules had made space for my things in her apartment, with a kind of care that told me she had been planning this for a long time. She had cleared drawers. She had reorganized the bookshelf to make room. She had created space in the bathroom for my toiletries. She had prepared for me the way people prepare for someone they have already decided will stay. I asked her about this later. She had said, "I have been hoping for a while that you would need a place to be. I did not know it would be this way. But I was ready for it." Cassidy's response came 48 hours after I retrieved my belongings. She had sent an email to my personal address marked as sent from her work account, which told me she had crafted it carefully during business hours. The email laid out her version of events. She had taken care of me. She had paid for things. She had given me opportunities. She had shaped me into someone worth knowing. And I had betrayed her by listening to someone who was jealous of our relationship and who wanted to separate us for her own purposes. The email said, "I understand you are acting from a place of confusion and emotional vulnerability. Jules has exploited your current state to poison your mind against the person who actually cared for you. When you are ready to acknowledge the truth of what happened, I will be willing to discuss it with you. Until then, I will be protecting my interests." Margot had read the email and had said, "This is her documenting her narrative. She is creating a record that positions herself as the victim, and you as the confused one. She is establishing a legal foundation for her version of events. This is a standard manipulation tactic used to build plausibility for claims she has not yet made. Save it. Forward it to me. Do not respond to anything she sends." I had saved it. I had forwarded it to Margot. I had not responded. What I had not anticipated was that Cassidy had money, and that money could move very fast, and that money could buy lawyers who were sophisticated about the particular art of financial intimidation. By the end of the week, I had received a formal notice of claim. Cassidy had hired lawyers. She had filed an assertion that the personal items I had retrieved from her apartment were joint property, and therefore my taking them constituted theft. She had claimed that I owed her money for the months she had paid my rent without my contribution. She had claimed that the engagement ring she had given me was a family heirloom, and that I needed to return it or face legal action. She had claimed that I had coerced her into a settlement, and that the settlement was therefore void. The engagement ring was a 4-carat diamond that Cassidy had selected without consulting me. I had worn it because I was supposed to. I had never liked it. It was too ostentatious. It was not a ring I would have chosen. It was exactly the kind of ring that Cassidy wanted to be seen wearing on someone's hand. It was a prop in her narrative about herself. Margot had read the claim and had said, "She is trying to make this financially expensive for you. She is trying to create the impression that you are in the wrong. She is hoping that you will get scared and go back to her, or that you will settle just to make it stop. Do not take the bait. We will handle this. She will not win this." What happened next was something I had not anticipated. Jules had money. She had been working for 15 years in advertising. She had made good choices about how to spend it and how to save it. She had not spent everything trying to impress people who did not matter. And when she understood that Cassidy's lawyers were going to be expensive and that I could not afford to fight them, she had simply said, "I will pay for the lawyer." I had said, "I cannot accept that. You have already helped me so much. I cannot ask you to pay for legal fees." She had said, "You are not asking. I am offering. And you can either accept it or you can watch me pay for it anyway, because I am not going to let Cassidy use money as a weapon against you. We are going to protect you, and we are going to do it together." The legal process had taken weeks. Weeks of Margot requesting documentation going back years. Bank statements from every month. Credit card records. The specific accounting of how the allowance had decreased month by month with mathematical precision. Weeks of her requesting communications between Cassidy and me dating back to the beginning of the relationship. Every email, every text message, every voice memo that had been sent and received. Every screenshot I could provide. Weeks of Margot building a case that showed, very clearly and with devastating precision, a pattern of financial control and psychological isolation that met the legal definition of financial abuse in the state of New York. Margot had explained the process to me in her office. She had said, "We need to show a pattern. A single incident would not be enough to prove anything. But a pattern of deliberate control that escalated over time? That is something the law understands. That is something the courts can act on. That is something that will hold up." During that time, Cassidy had not contacted me directly. She had gone through her lawyers. The legal communications had been cold and efficient and designed to intimidate through their formality and their implications. They suggested that I was unstable. They suggested that Jules had coerced me into leaving and that I was not capable of making my own decisions without guidance from someone else. They suggested that Cassidy was the only person who understood how to manage my life and that my leaving had been a mistake that would become increasingly clear to me as time went on. They suggested that I was being manipulated by someone with a personal agenda to separate me from my fiancé. Margot had handled each communication with the focused calm of someone who had seen this particular playbook many times before and who understood the chess moves that were being made. She had responded to each claim with documentation. She had answered each accusation with evidence. She had provided context for every financial decision. She had not responded to the intimidation tactics because she understood that intimidation tactics only work if you acknowledge them as legitimate and worthy of fear. The first substantive legal filing had come in the third week. Cassidy's lawyers had filed a claim suggesting that the items I had taken from the apartment constituted theft and that I needed to return them immediately or face criminal charges. Margot had responded with a detailed accounting of which items were mine before I moved in and which items I had brought with me. She had provided photographs from my previous apartment showing the furniture and belongings that I had owned. She had provided receipts for things I had purchased before the relationship. She had demonstrated with meticulous care that the items in question had been mine all along and that I had simply reclaimed them. The second filing had come in the fourth week. Cassidy's lawyers had claimed that I had signed documents agreeing to financial arrangements that I was now trying to repudiate. Margot had requested copies of these documents. When they arrived, they showed that I had signed papers, but the papers had been forms that explained nothing to me. They had contained no actual terms. They had been documents designed to create the appearance of informed consent without actually providing any information or disclosure. Margot had filed a response suggesting that these documents were void because they had been signed without proper disclosure or explanation and therefore did not represent a valid legal agreement. By week 5, Cassidy's lawyers had shifted strategy. They had suggested that the settlement agreement I had signed was obtained under duress because I had been living in Jules's apartment at the time and was therefore not in a stable enough mental state to make legal decisions. Margot had responded by providing testimony from 2 separate mental health professionals who had evaluated me and who had confirmed that I was competent and capable of making my own legal decisions. She had provided evidence that the settlement had been obtained voluntarily and that I had been represented by counsel throughout the process. By the time we reached week 7, Cassidy's legal team had begun to realize that they were losing. The documentation was too comprehensive. The pattern was too obvious. The control was too deliberately documented. They began to shift toward settlement conversations. My mother had called me. I explained everything. She listened and said, "I am proud of you for leaving. I am proud of you for trusting your friend. I am proud of you for not going back and for not blaming yourself for what happened." By the 4th week of the legal process, Cassidy's lawyers had begun to realize that they did not actually have a case. The items I had taken were my personal belongings. The money she claimed I owed her was actually her payment for the rent on an apartment where she lived and that I had occupied as her guest. The engagement ring was a gift and therefore my property. The settlement had been entered into freely and legally and was therefore binding. Margot had prepared a settlement agreement that was meticulously detailed. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. Cassidy would drop all claims immediately. She would make no further contact with me under any circumstances. She would not contact my workplace or my family or any mutual acquaintances with false stories about my mental health or my stability. She would not discuss me publicly or privately. She would not post about me on social media or through any digital platform. She would not attend events where I was known to be present. She would pay Margot's legal fees in full. She would acknowledge, in writing, that the items I had taken were my personal property and that I had removed them with no wrongdoing whatsoever. And most importantly, she would sign a document acknowledging the pattern of financial control and psychological abuse, accepting accountability for the harm she had caused, and agreeing to refrain from any similar behavior in future relationships. It was not an apology. Cassidy would never truly apologize, but it was documentation. It was proof. It was a legal acknowledgement that what had happened to me was real and had a name. Cassidy's lawyers had dragged the negotiation out for another 2 weeks, making small objections to various clauses and suggesting compromises that Margot would reject. But in the end, they had signed. They had not had a choice. The documentation was too clear. The pattern was too obvious. The trail of financial control that she had been so careful to create and hide had instead become the exact evidence that condemned her. Cassidy's own words in the form of text messages and emails and carefully documented financial records had damned her far more effectively than anything I could have said or any accusation I could have made. When the settlement was finalized, Margot had called me and said, very simply, "It is over. Legally, completely, it is over. She can never contact you again. If she does, we have grounds for restraining orders and criminal charges. You are protected." I said nothing in response to that call. I simply cried for an hour after she hung up. Jules had sat beside me and held my hand while I cried and had not asked me to explain or to minimize what I was feeling. The engagement ring had required its own moment of closure. I had taken it off that afternoon and had looked at it sitting on Jules's kitchen table in the sunlight. It was beautiful in an abstract way. 4 carats of carefully selected diamond in a platinum setting that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. I had understood, looking at it, that this ring had never represented love to Cassidy. It had represented ownership. It had represented her claim on me. It had represented her desire to make visible to the world that I belonged to her. Every time I had worn it, I had been advertising her acquisition of me. I had put it in a small wooden box that Jules had lined with tissue paper. I had written a note that said simply, "This was never mine." I had mailed it to Cassidy's lawyers with instructions to deliver it to her personally. When Cassidy's lawyers sent back a formal acknowledgement of receipt, it felt like the final piece of the transaction was complete. It felt like I had returned everything that she had given me in exchange for taking back everything that she had taken from me. We were even. We were free of each other. For the first time in 8 months, I had not been obligated to anyone. For the first time since I had met Cassidy, I had been free to make decisions based on what I wanted, instead of based on what would keep someone else happy or what would prevent someone else from becoming angry. The freedom was terrifying. The freedom meant I had to know who I was and what I wanted and how to ask for it. The freedom was also intoxicating. I could make choices based purely on my own desires. The freedom was the thing I had not known I was missing until it was suddenly available to me. It was the space I had needed to become myself again. 6 weeks later, on the porch in Vermont, Jules said, "I need you to know I am not going anywhere. I love you. Do you know that?" I said, "I know." She had said, "Do you know that I love you?" I had said, "Yes." She had said, "Do you know that I will wait as long as you need me to wait? I have already waited a decade. I can wait as long as it takes. I will give you the time that you need to figure out what you want and who you want to be. I will not rush you or push you towards something you are not ready for. I will simply be here and I will choose you every single day until you decide what you want to do." And I had looked at her and I had understood something that I had been understanding slowly over the course of weeks in her apartment. That this woman had been waiting for a long time. that she had organized her entire adult life around the possibility of me eventually becoming available to her, that she had been willing to wait for years if necessary, that she had never once suggested that I owed her anything in return for her attention and care. I had said, "I do not want you to wait anymore. I have spent 8 months having someone wait for me to become the version of myself that they wanted me to be. I do not want you to wait for me to be anything other than what I am right now. I want you to want me the way I am right now. Broken, confused, still figuring out how to be a person who makes her own decisions without running them by someone else first." She had looked at me for a long time, and I had seen her registering what I was saying and understanding that something had shifted. I had said, "I love you. I do not know if I love you the way you love me yet, but I know that I do not want to be without you. I know that you are the first person in my adult life who has chosen me without trying to change me into something else. I know that being around you makes me feel less small. I know that you are the person I want to become when I am done becoming someone new." She had reached over and had taken my hand, not in the way that was romantic or leading toward anything, in the way that was just two people holding on to each other, because it felt true, and because the moment required something tangible to hold on to. We had sat like that for an hour as the light faded completely and the stars began to appear. That night, in the small inn in Vermont, with the sound of the October wind outside, we kissed. It had not been frantic or desperate or rushed. It had been patient in a way that suggested she had been patient this whole time. It had been earned. When it was over, she pulled back and said, "I have been imagining that for a very long time." I said, "I am free." In October, Jules and I took a trip to Vermont. On the porch of the inn, Jules said, "I need you to know that I am not going anywhere. I need you to know that I would be here even if you never wanted anything from me beyond friendship." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you know that I love you?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I do not want you to wait anymore. I have spent 8 months having someone wait for me to become the version of myself that they wanted me to be. I do not want you to wait for me to be anything other than what I am right now. Broken, confused, still figuring out how to be myself." She looked at me for a long time. I said, "I love you too. I do not know if I love you the way you love me yet, but I know that I do not want to be without you. You are the first person who has chosen me without trying to change me." She reached over and took my hand. We sat like that as the light faded and the stars appeared. That night, we kissed. It was patient and earned. When it was over, she said, "I have been imagining that for a very long time." She said, "I have been in love with you since the 3rd week of college. I watched you try to be what other people needed, and I watched you get smaller and smaller in service of people who were never going to be generous enough to let you be full-sized. But I cannot watch you do it to yourself anymore." By the time we returned to the city on Sunday evening, something had shifted inside me. I had stopped looking over my shoulder for Cassidy. I had stopped checking my email expecting manipulation. I had stopped being afraid that some version of Cassidy's narrative was true and that I was unstable and confused and in need of her guidance. I had stopped carrying the weight of her story about who I was. Instead, I had started being present in my own life in a way that I had not been present since before I met Cassidy. I had gone back to work on Monday and had discovered that the firm had been more supportive than I realized during my absence. The senior partners had approached me personally and had apologized for not intervening sooner when they realized what was happening. They had asked me to take on better cases with more autonomy. I had been given real responsibility instead of just billable hours. I had been allowed to rebuild my professional life without someone controlling how I did it. I had started to understand what it meant to work for people who valued my contribution and who wanted me to succeed not as a reflection of themselves but as a genuine colleague. In November, after 6 months of living in Jules's apartment and building something real with her, Jules and I had moved into a new apartment together. It was not her apartment anymore. It was ours. We had selected it together from a list of options, discussing what we wanted and what mattered to us. We had decorated it according to both of our tastes. It was a space that represented both of us without either of us erasing the other. It was the first space I had ever lived in where I did not feel like a visitor in someone else's life. It was the first space where I felt like I belonged. Cassidy had tried to contact me one more time on the day we moved into the new apartment. She had sent a message to my work email suggesting that she wanted to talk, that she had missed me, that she thought there might be a way to salvage what we had had. The email was careful. It was apologetic in tone. It suggested that she had been thinking about what she had done and that she was sorry. I had forwarded the message to Margot without reading it twice. Margot had sent a formal letter to Cassidy's lawyers, reminding them that the settlement agreement prohibited contact of any kind and that any further attempts to contact me would result in the legal protections being enforced and additional charges being filed. There had been no response. Cassidy had finally, truly, understood that she had lost the ability to reach me. She had lost access to me in every way that mattered. On New Year's Eve, we stood on the roof. I said thank you. She said, for what? I said, for choosing me. She said, I will keep choosing you, every single day, as long as you want me to choose you. By spring, I wrote my mother an email explaining everything. She called me immediately. We had talked for an hour. She had shared her own story about my father and about the ways she had learned to accept a version of love that diminished her. She had told me about the ways that she had tried to protect me from her own damage and how that protection had left me unprepared. She had told me that she was proud of me for recognizing the pattern and for breaking it. She had told me that she loved me. She had told me that she wanted to meet Jules. We had invited her to the city for lunch on a Saturday in April, and I had felt the specific anxiety that comes from trying to introduce someone important to your past to someone important to your present. Jules had been nervous in the way that people are nervous when they understand that they are being assessed. My mother had been uncertain in the way that mothers are uncertain when they are meeting someone their daughter has entrusted with the most vulnerable part of her life. But by the end of the meal, something had shifted between the three of us. My mother had looked at the way Jules and I moved around each other, the way she anticipated my needs without being asked, the way she looked at me when she thought I was not paying attention, the way I looked at her like she had solved something in me that I did not know was broken. My mother had set down her fork halfway through dessert. She had looked at Jules for a long moment. Then she had said, I see what happened here. I see how you showed up for my daughter when she could not show up for herself. I see how you waited and did not make her feel obligated for your waiting. Thank you for loving my daughter better than I knew how to teach her to love herself. Thank you for seeing what was happening when she could not see it. Thank you for being patient while she figured out that she was worth being patient for. Thank you for claiming her as someone worth claiming. Jules had reached over and had taken my hand under the table. My mother had seen the gesture and had smiled in a way that suggested she understood everything that needed to be understood. By summer, we had been together for almost a year. We took a trip to the beach. We were visible and held hands in public. On the last night, Jules said, I want to do this forever. I said, yes. Cassidy had eventually moved on in every way that mattered. She had taken a position at a different firm in a different city. She had left the city. She had removed herself from the landscape of my life. By the time she left, I had already forgotten what her face looked like in the space of a moment where she was thinking about something. I had already stopped having the specific anxiety that her name used to produce in my chest. She had become just a person I used to know, and then a person I had known, and then a person I barely remembered except as evidence of a lesson I had learned. In 1 year, I went from begging for money to knowing my own worth. Jules was there for all of it. This is what being loved correctly looks like. Someone chooses you not for who you could become, but because you are already enough.